Very pleased to be here. Can't really see you, as Daisy said, but I'm sure you're there. I've got, just looking down, yep, I can see all of that, 45 minutes, and I'm going to talk about, as it says here, the power of curiosity. So something that's been running underneath everything that's been said today. And possibly to your disappointment, I'm going to agree with quite a lot that Daisy's just been saying, not least of which the re-emphasis that she's putting into assessment for learning, and it turns out a joint passion in the pedagogies that group themselves around what Anders Ericsson might call deliberate practice, and I'll use lots of different other phrases. I want to just start by declaring an interest, as this is an assessment conference. I'm slightly startled to have been given this joint appointment to try and figure out how in 2021 we reliably and validly and cross-culturally test something as complex as creative thinking. I'm not an assessment expert, so I need to say that straight away, but luckily my co-chair Jack Buckley is and has been deeply involved in many of those kinds of big-scale tests in the States and internationally. When I was, and I'm also, as it happens, an English teacher by background. My first degree is English language and literature. When I was starting out training to be a teacher, as it happened at Oxford, and as it happened, Chris Woodhead was my tutor, I was very much enjoying his then radicalism about the whole business of assessment. He thought that the comprehension drills we put kids through were pretty close to idiotic. And he had a favourite little game that we used to play. It goes like this. I'll play it with you. I'm going to read you two sentences and then I'm going to test you. Sentence number 1, an Iggy Fung was klepting in the pludge. Sentence number 2, Iggy Fungs are shackly made for grampling. Now my question to you of comprehension is, question 1, where was the Iggy Plung klepting? Complete sentence, please. You can do it, can't you? An Iggy Plung was klepting in the pludge. Question 2, if your short-term memory is up to it, what are Iggy Fungs shackly made for? Thank you so much. Yes, you've got the point. And complete gibberish, and the answer is complete gibberish, tells us very little about any comprehension in the real sense. Now, of course, it's a stereotype and a parody, and therefore a really good example to make a point, but a really poor example to make an argument out of. Fast forward, I by then had been teaching for 4 or 5 years on the Blackbird Leys estate in Oxford. If you know Oxford, you'll know it's not the easiest of schools. To my astonishment, the National Curriculum Review had led to the injection of oracy. Do you remember this in GCSE English? And many of us were terribly excited about this. I, for one, was. And I was particularly excited because OUP commissioned me to, with a writer friend of mine, to write a book called Talking Sense, which was all about the first serious attempt to teach and here's the rub. Of course, to be able to teach oracy and speaking and listening, I really had to become a lot more detailed in my own thinking about what it is and what it was. And therefore, the foundation of all of our assessment and teaching work is, of course, understanding what our desired outcomes are and what the components, if you like, the small steps that Daisy was talking about, are to make that up. So now I find myself with this exciting challenge and many a bear pit around me because the unintended consequences of trying to test creative thinking are legion. What I want to do now is to explore with you 5 areas, really. The first, unsurprisingly, framed as questions because that's the land that we're in, and the second, observations, but with a twinkle, I hope you'll feel, in the voice. Curiosity is much lauded these days. I can't imagine encountering an educator who didn't think it was a good thing. But 'twas not ever thus. The Greeks thought it was a good thing. They thought it was a virtue. In the Middle Ages, it became complicated by the church, essentially, and it became something of a bad thing, possibly even a vice, an appetite of a not a terribly attractive and possibly moral purpose. It gets rehabilitated in the 17th century, and possibly we have Galileo to thank a little bit about that, as it seems to be closely associated with scientific rigor. These days, well, certainly in the last 50, 70 years, there's been a really interesting development of thinking, stimulated not entirely by psychologists, but quite a lot, and most recently by neuroscientists. So what is it? Well, I'm going to argue that it's a multi-headed, multi-dimensioned concept. I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit for you. I'm going to suggest that it relates to not just getting better at maths, which is extremely important, or getting better at running marathons, which is equally important but different. But it's also really important for driving some valuable learning habits which are good for learning throughout life, and indeed, unsurprisingly, because school is life when you're at school, Many people have littered our stage with useful things about curiosity, many of which are contradictory. That's Samuel Johnson. But if you came forward a few years, you'd get into the interesting assertion that George Lerstein makes, that it's dangerous, that curiosity is a dangerous thing. Like sexual attraction, he says, curiosity often produces impulsive behaviours and attempts at self-control. I haven't noticed the latter, personally, when I encounter great sexual attraction, but there we go. Maybe that's my limited life. So it is for some such a deeply rooted desire that it is, of course, potentially to be used for good or ill. In literature, our friend Alice is well known for her curiouser behaviour. But before we get to Alice, because I'm going to use her to exemplify two versions of curiosity, I want to try a curious card trick out on you, please. Do you give me your permission to do that? I forgot to ask you to sign the disclaimer form when you came in. So this is not my card trick, it's a wonderful Scottish educational philosopher Andy Clark's card trick, and if you know it, just keep stum, please. So would you please choose one card to the exclusion of the other 4 cards that I'm giving you as a possible choice palette? Have you all got one? Good, this is going to be a test of statistical curiosity. I'm now going to make an assertion to you, and watch how you react. My assertion is that, notwithstanding anything that might pass for a 1 in 5 rule, nevertheless, I know that in this particular group, on this particular day, you have all chosen the same card. Is this believable? I was informed by the organisers that we'd assembled the finest minds in this part of King's Cross, and I'm having my doubts at the moment. Okay, so it's patently ridiculous, isn't it? So, okay, just humour me then. Think of this as a kind of test in development. And just look away, because I'm going to prove you wrong by removing your card. Look away now, and your card has gone. Slightly nervous laughter from some people. A moment of rapid dawning of realisation in others. OK, this is a moment of honesty, colleagues. How many people thought just for a moment, blimey, he's pulled it off? Thank you for your honesty. How many of you thought, with a kind of shrug of your insouciant shoulders, nah, he's taken the whole lot away? Oh dear, how many of you are still trying to work it out? Anyone in the data set who never puts their hand up in public? Nah, you can't answer that one, can you? Okay. So this is a game. It's a game with a point, and the point that Andy Clark makes is not the point I'm going to make. My point is that you fell for the to the exclusion of the other 4 trick. It's something we perpetrate on kids day in, day out. It's called the end of module test in schools. We teach the most curiously engaging piece of work, and it doesn't matter what pedagogy we use. Well, I'm just imagining you're a great teacher teaching appropriately, and your kids are thoroughly engaged, and then you hear yourself saying, oh, and for the end of module test, I'm going to be asking you to, and the minds close down to that which they think is going to be tested. True? Yes, it is true. We all know it's true, and we all do it, and we're all human, and it's just curious. And I think partly that psychological manipulation or verbal manipulation of mine was why you fell for that one, just for a second, those of you who did. Now, look away for my second test if you do not wish to see a naked woman. Look up if you do. And now, if you can see her, especially if she responds to the invitation to appear, gently when you can see her, be kind enough just to put your hand up and show me that you can see her. Can everybody see her? Thank you. Completely ridiculous. There's no woman at the window at all. Look again. Apply some Enlightenment rationality, please. There is, it appears, a cat, and above the cat there is a shelf, and on the shelf there's a kind of draggly hair. Oh no, it's not, it's a pot plant, and by the right there's a curtain, and in the middle there's a wine glass, and down here are some underwear swinging in the lovely King's Cross breeze by the water. Yes? So, rationalist amongst you, would you agree that there is rationally not a woman at the window? There's a bunch of space left by some objects in the woman at the window. Would you agree? Okay. So again, moment of honesty, how many of you can still see a woman at the window? The vast majority. Okay. So the human brain is pretty useless at many things in life, isn't it? But the point I want to make is that curiosity is rapidly quenched when we see the world our way and we stop looking at alternatives. And that's my educational mission, to prevent that, to stop these silly binary opposites that seem to bedevil our educational system at the moment. And I'm going to try and offer you some alternatives with the conjunction "and" that I feel there's substantial and significant and interesting research to support. So what is curiosity? Well, it is, as I said, a multidimensional field, and I think that Jonathan Rowson's work at the RSA is as good as any on this. He was looking at ecological choice points, at nudge, if you like, in the way that we make those choices. But his definition and his literature search on curiosity is terrific, and you can see in those 4 quadrants the different kinds of things. And I want to just take a couple of them and exemplify them. Let's look at curiosity as in perceptual and epistemic, and then curiosity as in exploration and as in absorption. So epistemic curiosity is perhaps the most curious and the thing that makes us uniquely human. It is the fact that we're interested not just in the what and the who and the when, but the why and the how. And that's unique. It's quite different from the perceptual curiosity that all animals have. If something novel appears in their environment, they're either going to be scared of it or attack it and kill it or whatever they're going to do. In terms of absorption and exploration, there's a kind of broad scanning. And of course, a lot of theorists around curiosity link it to evolution. There's a broad scanning sense in which knowing a lot about, or a little about a lot, and being able to look around the place is a pretty smart thing to do. And of course, there's that other aspect of that, which is to go deep and to really, really, really understand what it is you're trying to understand. If I were to summon up Alice now to help us see epistemic, then I might invite you to consider that even in freefall, Alice is still pondering about the meaning of latitude or longitude and the degree to which it was a relevant concept when she first encountered it. By contrast, her perceptual curiosity was very much engaged by the mysterious rabbit, who isn't mysterious because he's a rabbit or even because he's wrongly sized, depending on which stage of the story you're in, but because he's got a watch. And Alice has never seen a rabbit with a watch, therefore it's novel and interesting. If we took the other 2 axes and looked at them, I'm not suggesting we all go high diving, but I am intellectually suggesting that many of us at many times go high diving. Then that exploratory meme or gene in us is all about finding challenge, finding those exotic, difficult situations. And the absorption is more about going deep. I think you'll have to decide who is and who is not absorbed in that picture. It's very difficult, and this picture is partly there for that reason, to measure curiosity in action. It's extremely difficult because I don't know what's going on inside your head. I can look at the artifacts. I can look at things that you do. This is going to be my challenge in the creative thinking test. We have highly sophisticated testing apparatus so we can process trace. We can see how I thought about an answer and how long I spent doing it, what I then decided, and how many goes I had at it. We can even get at perseverance, therefore, in a certain sort of context, all of those things. Now, I've been passionate about this for quite a while, and with my friend and colleague Guy Claxton wrote a relatively polemic book about 3 years ago, really aimed at parents to try and we've neatened up some of the capabilities for which there's really good evidence. I'm about to share that evidence, or learning habits. We neatened them up to words beginning with the letter C, simply because life's too short and we wanted to make it accessible, and we wanted to make it a dialogue piece with thoughtful teachers and indeed with parents. And creativity or curiosity. All of these are kind of interlinked. And you do get into apples and pears problems, obviously, because some of them have a conceptual richness. And forgive me, this is not a neatly designed set of objectives which can equally be tested. But I think you'd mostly agree that curiosity is rarely exercised only as a solo pursuit, and therefore there's something about collaboration. That, as Daisy was very eloquently suggesting, quite a lot of what we're doing is communication, whether it's in figures or numbers or words. And a lot of the way we go through that, testable, very interesting. I like that idea about multiple choice being a really good instrument for formative assessment. I wholly agree with that. But in terms of commitment to the task or perseverance, and somewhere between commitment and craftsmanship is indeed deliberate practice, because you need that ethic of excellence, but you need to be able to break it down into smaller parts to be able to do that and then put it back together. And confidence, not as in self-esteem or something that you can imagine that you kind of self-award. Confidence is the outcome, isn't it, of doing tricky things, tricky, worthwhile things that are just beyond your reach, back to that earlier conversation about Vygotsky. I'm very interested in this, and I'm very excited but daunted that this model, and here you can see that I'm operating the principle of a big concept being broken down first of all into 5 core dimensions, and then into each one of those into 3 small steps, back to deliberate practice analogy. Indeed, deliberate practice and the family of teaching and learning methods around it is absolutely what we believe to be core here. As is playful experimentation, if you're trying to get at the imaginative and inquisitive, as is various techniques we know work well for framing and reframing in terms of persistence and various strategies, as is the organization and the ecology of the classroom or the studio or workshop for collaborative, and disciplined is, well, right in the space of deliberate practice. It's a curious paradox about curiosity that, as Jerome Bruner observed, it has this kind of both unbridled aspect and this more focused aspect. And it is possible, therefore, to be very irritated by very curious people. I don't know how many of you are parents. How many of you are parents? I'm curious to know. Congratulations or commiserations, depending on how it's seeming today. But I've noticed that there is a myth, isn't there, that children ask fewer questions as they get older. It's a silly myth, isn't it? Because as you know more, you ask deeper and fewer questions, generally, don't you? So it's silly to extrapolate from that we're just less interested or school is boring. I think that's a very lazy generalization. But nevertheless, I am bombarded on a daily basis. I've got my youngest 2 are 13, boy, girl, twins. You will have noticed, won't you? A boy, girl, you'll have noticed they're probably different. They are. They're non-identical twins. I've got a little learning laboratory at home. And I notice how they ask questions and how different those questions are. But I'm bombarded with them. And if I took that to be a sign that it was a dull and wearisome thing, that they were interested in everything that came along, I would be a distracted and poor and unhappy parent. What I've got to manage is distractibility. So I've got to be, I see, as a parent, a coach, encouraging and nurturing their passions, but recognizing that if we just spread ourselves so thinly, we'll never get really good at the marathon that we want to run, and maybe just manage a short sprint on a good day. So why does all of this matter? Well, I think there used to be a debate about this. Interestingly, I'm going to argue that debate is hardly a novel thing, and there's been growing certainty, or convergence perhaps would be a more accurate technical term, to describe a sense across the world, in the world's curricula, that these kind of things matter. They matter as much, but not more, than the things that organize most children's lives, their school timetable. When my children go off to school in the morning and I ask them what they're doing at school, they answer that question by showing me their timetable. That isn't what they're going to do at school. That's the way school is organized. In amongst all of those things, they're learning all sorts of other things. And all those other things, I think, and I believe, can and need to be embedded rigorously in the context. There's no such thing, can I slay another myth here? There's no such thing as teaching curiosity or capability or character in the abstract. It's such a silly idea. I don't know where it came from. It did a number of people who had some rather good ideas and no service at all. It kind of put a silly wedge in an otherwise sensible debate between knowledge, skill, capability. We need them embedded. And just look at the work of Carol McGuinness, analysing the early thinking skills movement to see how silly that was. But we know from across the world that there is an emerging consensus, and we know it in a number of different ways. We know from the work of psychologists that some of these things, here we see them kind of with a virtue framework, which is one way of positioning this, are seen to be generally valued. If you look at the websites of most schools, you'll find words a little bit like that. And they discuss and describe the sort of pro-social behaviours that school is about developing, and that's great. I'm going to come on to, if you like, the pro-epistemic behaviours, which was a bit like the colleague just before the fire alarm started in her very elegant description of what makes a good learner. And those are the kind of things I'm particularly interested in. I'm not saying I'm amoral. I'm saying that that's a decision that a school institution needs to make. But I think the research underpinning some of these other things is increasingly pretty high. This is not research, this is market research. This is the Times Higher Education Supplement, not beyond using that. And the point it's trying to make, as you can see pretty obviously, is that words like curiosity and resilience and creativity and collaboration and the OECD's favourite words, problem solving and adaptability, are in demand by employers and for graduates leaving university, and there's a gap. So the kind of demand side is not being matched by the supply side. So there's a kind of importance there. It's not the same kind of importance as saying it's a good thing because it's a good thing. There are little bits of research about curiosity which are really interesting, and I'm just going to give you a couple of papers here in case you're curious about curiosity. But essentially, I want to say that the mechanisms of curiosity are under-researched. Their pragmatic exemplification in classrooms are under-researched. We don't know enough about them. They get scooped up into great buckets like collaborative or cooperative learning or inquiry-led learning or problem-based learning. And of course, those are too big. As a researcher, I can't be sure that I'm comparing one thing with another, and they're just too big as a concept. They're interesting concepts to show a direction of travel, but they're too big for us to really be useful. So there's just a kind of example there. And another one here about recall. I'll come back to recall, whatever it is. You say recall, I say recall, whatever we mean. The truth is, as again, we don't completely understand the mechanisms, although I'm going to suggest a few things which will add weight, I think, to the deliberate practice arguments that Daisy was making. So there's some importance, but there's some further refined research here that suggests that certain learning habits, and here the language is not terribly useful, so I'm calling them learning habits because that's what I ended up calling them in the title for this. The OECD calls them competencies. I, in my workplace, call them dispositions. I think there's a really important semantic distinction between knowledge, skill, and knowledge and skill in action. Which is probably a habit over time, and between disposition, which is I know what kindness is, I know how to be kind, and I actually am kind in my lived experience, or I know how to persevere when the going gets tricky. I have some techniques, I have some strategies, I know how it's different in these contexts, I know how to read the room to know whether that nice teacher is there or that teacher who always makes me feel uncomfortable, and I know all of that, and I manage to deploy that routinely in a range of contexts, a kind of transfer. I'll come on to transfer. Transfer's very complex, very tricky, but does happen. If it didn't happen, anyone chairing a panel discussion wouldn't be able to function, or anybody entering a meeting where they didn't feel that they were a complete expert would flounder. Of course it happens. The question is how it happens. And again, we're quite flaccid about some of those mechanisms. So here's that well-known left-wing progressive James Heckman, Nobel Economics laureate, making the case very rigorously, very eloquently for some of these things. I was joking, he's not that, he's just a really good economist. For some of the things I think that we need, if you like, his cast list for the learning habits that society needs. And you see we've got all sorts of challenges here, haven't we? We've got fostering and measuring interventions. We've got character skills. Not everybody likes the phrase character. Character leads us into a land that suggests that, there's an old chestnut. Is character caught or taught? And the answer is yes, it is. Both. There's a cultural dimension, and I now am absolutely sure from looking at the research and watching practices, it is possible to teach people how to do certain things. Certain pedagogical decisions that we take make it more likely that they're going to function in different ways. Here's the Education Endowment Foundation-funded work of the splendid Leslie Gutman and Ingrid Schoen at the UCL Institute. And what is remarkable to me as an educational researcher is how incredibly similar their list is to the Economist list. You know, that's really interesting, isn't it? So there's a demand side, there's a supply side, there's a willingness amongst most thoughtful parents, there's certainly a willingness and some experimentation among most teachers that I know. It's not tested. Enter OECD 2021 creative thinking, scary moment, because it will be. Luckily, that's anonymous. It's a kind of rising or falling tide moment of getting a fix on. So hopefully it can be almost entirely formative. That's my mission, to make it so. So back to the special subject that I've been exploring and the unsubtle suggestion that you might like to have a look at this book. We're going to be taking in this, not all of those because it's multidimensional, but probably, and this is just work in progress, we're in discussions at the moment. I was trying to persuade the PISA board the week before last, that we'll be looking at certain skills, the ones in the orange, maybe not all of them, but those are the ones that we'll be looking at. We're having a debate about context. All of you experts in assessment will know why we're doing that. We're thinking about the advisability or inadvisability. The core focus in 2021 is on maths, of making a read across between maths and this, which might be quite interesting, I think, would frustrate some stereotypical thinking about creative thinking, wouldn't it? And we're looking at these areas here coloured in pink. We know that we can get at them through the self-report that goes out to students, and we're now looking at the way in which technology might be usable to allow us to trace student efforts in the way that Patrick Griffin's group in Melbourne has had a go in collaborative problem solving. I read with interest in your research digest that's in our pack some very healthy critique that one of your colleagues offered on that whole methodology, and I would share some of those, and we're trying to learn from the experience of testing collaborative problem solving. We're not going to go down the collaborative problem solving route because PISA wants us to try something else out. It is the innovative domain, English, maths, science, and one other every 3 years, and innovative domain is the title for the one other. Across the world, curricula are saying countries, education ministers, sometimes not just education ministries, but also the innovation and economic engine of the country. Very poignant, I think, this in the light of the budget yesterday, which didn't really, in my view, do enough on all of these important issues, are thinking about what these kinds of things are. Now, you may well be about to get a bout of linguistic indigestion when you read the phrase transversal competencies. And I think this is part of the problem in the world that I'm trying to talk about, that we talk jargon. I hope you don't feel I've been talking much jargon so far. I haven't yet said, by the way, three phrases that I utterly dislike with venom. 21st century skills, top of my list. What a lazy way of describing halfway through, nearly through the 2nd century of the 3rd millennium. What ridiculous. Next in my pecking order would be soft skills, much loved by employers. Has an unfortunate, unintended consequence of suggesting that they don't really matter or that they're not very difficult to acquire. They are. And the psychologist in me utterly dislikes non-cognitive and cognitive. This is kind of late legacy of the Enlightenment. This is, go and read Antonio Damasio's work on this, and you'll see that, you know, the cognitive is just a shorthand for tricky maths and science, isn't it, basically? And the non-cognitive is a shorthand for design and technology, things we do in tutor groups, and everything else that doesn't really matter. I don't mean that. You know I don't mean that. But all those really valuable learning habits that need to be embedded in these academic disciplines that have a knowledge component, a skill component, and a disposition to be acted, enacted, or not. Harvard educational researcher David Perkins has a lovely expression to describe these. He calls the moment when you do or do not deploy them as sensitivity to occasion. That's to say, if you've been well taught, you've been taught them in a number of different contexts, you recognize their similarities and differences, and you know when and how and if and whether or whether not to deploy them in different contexts. In Australia, they've been quite clear. They've nominated a number of core capabilities. I do a lot of my work in Australia. We have a proof of concept in the state of Victoria, which is now already measuring and reporting on progress. Progress I prefer to assessment, I think. Progress in critical and creative thinking. So we have an interesting proof of concept, as well as the OECD. work. In Canada, Michael Fullan has landed on a similar but different set of Cs. I'm not saying that because I need to hide behind other colleagues. I'm kind of saying it because, you know, it becomes wearisome after a bit to argue for whether or not these are important, and much more interesting to have complex, interesting, nuanced discussions about how best they can be deployed and developed, and that's where I'd like to be. So in the 15 minutes that I have left with this helpful timer, I'm going to just focus on questions a little bit, questions as exemplification of curiosity, but also questions with attitude, questions that I believe might help towards the kinds of target learning habits or dispositions that I've been talking about. In this, I'm going to take 4 very broad buckets, if you like, categories, and I'm at a couple of moments going to draw on a splendid book, which some of you may know, called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, which very usefully aggregates up some of the learning in these areas. Not exclusively, I'll try and signpost you to other areas when it seems relevant to me. Just before I start talking about questions, and I'm talking about questions that teachers ask, it is, of course, well known, I'm guessing you know it, that teachers ask more questions in classrooms than children do. You know that, don't you? It depends, read the different research, but double quite often. And there are some favourite teacher questions, aren't there? And the most favourite, sadly, in some classrooms, is where teacher knows the information, basically, and is eliciting. So a good example of this, a perfectly reasonable one, would be when you divide 24 by 8, what do you get? Or go back to some of those nice fractions that Daisy was showing us. But unfortunately, that has a concomitant, which is when it becomes a role-modelled attitude, that questions to which teacher does not know the answer are not really welcome in my classroom. I was in a classroom the other day when the teacher very boldly, I think, because there's quite an emphasis, isn't there, on professional knowledge, quite rightly so, has a wall of the classroom where she puts questions to which nobody in the class yet knows the answer. That seems to be a laudable ecological decision that a teacher has taken. A second question that teachers are really splendid at answering is the rhetorical question with edge. Like, is that the right way to enter the classroom? And you can I'm sure you've got your own litany of questions like that, and they can be used, deployed very effectively. They are very good behaviour management sometimes, but not over time because they're not kind. And then, of course, there are the genuine questions, the super questions, which are open-ended. If you were going to describe the way Cindy walked into the classroom this morning, what metaphor would you use? Now, there's an interesting question, and not at all barbed towards Cindy, who presumably came in a way that suggested she was not looking forward to your great lesson. And fourthly, really nice questions to seek the child's preference. Sometimes it's kind of fairly binary, like would you like to take the test before lunch or after? Not much choice in that. But there are, of course, subtle, scaffolded, Vygotskian, to go back to earlier on, ways of managing the environment in which we can, as skillful professionals, make sure there is the right kind of progression. So 4 broad questions here. Kinds of questions, something about starting out, something about sustaining, something about when you finished, and something about transfer. They're different. I'll just give you a few examples. They really will come at a bit of a lick. But in terms of, and I think there's a really strong read across, by the way. I'll be interested to know what Daisy thinks about this overlap between a redefined assessment for learning and deliberate practice. I think there's a really, really strong and potent connection here, which we might, or indeed might not, like to explore. So if you were looking at these kinds of things, if you were looking at, say, attention-grabbing questions, it might be as simple as, what's this? And this is an object that nobody has seen before, ever. Or what happened next? A much used device by drama teachers, English teachers, anyone, or historians, anybody wanted to get some speculation going. Or in media, perhaps, what happened just before this? So something, anyway, that connects with young people's epistemic curiosity. Remember, we are naturally disposed to be curious, and unless something really bad has happened, you don't have to fish around too far to find that. And the essence of good teaching and good learning and good assessment is, of course, connecting to the student's existing knowledge and skill. So it might be, tell me what French words you already know in English. That would be a good example, wouldn't it? Where you can start to build on, and then you might move out to other loan words. I'm taking an English teacher's description there. If we were looking at predicting potential outcomes, I don't think I really need to go there because it's obvious, but I'm actually going to frame it as a learning question, and it might be something like, so what concepts or ideas do you think might come up in this topic, or this lesson, or this discussion of acids and bases? And this allows us immediately to start to see that the distinction between transferable and specific can be silly if pushed to logical conclusions, because prototyping in engineering and drafting in art and design and English writing and going through the rigorous stages of scientific experimentation turn out to be a really interesting set of generic things that you can do, but you do differently and with different lexis in different contexts. But there's a huge read across to what they are. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those, but I think I would like to say, as we're at a conference on assessment 1, which I wouldn't have known would be saying quite so much, as well as the more obvious assessment for learning goal setting, the where are you going here, which is really, really important. I think there's a really interesting literature emerging about pre-testing. And I think, interestingly, again, it transcends different views of what teaching is about. So pre-testing works really, really well in a highly refined further maths lesson, where you invite a child to figure out a problem. For me, it's a really good example of flipped learning, before they even get to your class, and then you work it round and you work it out. And it turns out from the Make It Stick book earlier on, I was mentioning that this leads to not just better learning, but better recall and better performance. You could equally do it, but not too much, and here's where we need to be subtle. If you were starting more of what you might call an exploration, a multidisciplinary inquiry about something. And the danger here is that we forget that, of course, little people or novices know much less, and their short-term memory, if you like to use it, this is not how short-term memory works, but it easily gets clogged up with stuff that stops them doing anything that's potentially very useful. It's the obvious reason why we need, in sequential subjects like maths, to have done the adding and subtracting before we do the multiplying, the long division, or the other, and then onto our quadratic equations, etc. But it works too, to a certain extent, in problem-based learning, that you allow a managed struggle, but not too much. And the danger is that some advocates of inquiry-led teaching don't have the subtlety and the skill to be able to know exactly the prior level of learning and experience of the student, and therefore the scaffolding that they need, and the conceptual scaffolding, because they need to know what the it is they're trying to inquire into, to have prepared them in an appropriate way so that they will do something meaningful and make progress through that. Sustaining curiosity is by and large something that teachers are pretty good at, I think. It's the web and weft, isn't it, of teaching, frankly. And just a few examples here, not many. Analysing and generalising work very well. They are generic skills in a number of different areas of the curriculum with different language and different contexts and operating at different levels of sophistication depending on... Do you see where I'm going in this? It really is unhelpful to try and put too many barriers and wedges in the middle, but, you know, it might be a why did that happen, or what do you think this lesson is about, or if X and Y have already happened, why is Z happening now? And that, not just a science lesson. It might be any lesson where there are variables, or let's dig down to, let's go to extending or digging deeper, or as you might say, interpolating. Would this be true when kind of questions would be very important. Just as next down that list, what could you do if questions. And you see at the bottom there, I think absolutely essential to the sustaining of curiosity is deliberate practice. Because curiosity can evaporate if I'm asked to run, I think as Daisy was arguing, a marathon in every physics lesson, I may not make it. It's too much. I may not even be able to go through the exercise that I thought I could do in the gym because I haven't quite got whatever I need as the precursor to doing the exercise in the gym. I may not even be good for a 3-kilometre trot around my fields because I haven't yet got the fact that, you know, it's a bit different when you're out on the fields as opposed to when you're running on a running machine, and so forth. So deliberate practice and real-time feedback, which I think we're getting so much better and more sophisticated at in terms of assessment. In the third type of my questions here, really, this might happen at any stage. It'll happen at different stages because students move at different paces, but it will happen at end of modules, end of lessons, end of periods of work, and so forth. And here I think, I haven't got time to read too many examples here. Let me see, what might I give you as an example? They're fairly straightforward, I think, so I'm not sure I'm even going to worry too much. Let me say, let's try a student's describing how knowledge and understanding has changed, how after studying in science, in biology, the way the earthworm functions, how you might ask, do earthworms differ from us in how they breathe, or how are they similar to us, would be an obvious example there. Now, self-testing, I think, is the perfect antidote to the lazy revision that too many kids do in school. This notion that by highlighting and rereading to excess and probably boredom and probably terminal boredom is, I mean, there is an academic term for this. Please turn the recording machines off. It's simply not true. It's not a good and efficient way of recovering and recalling and being able to use and being able to transfer. What we need to be able to do is to learn the skill, and this is an applicable skill in different contexts, of self-testing, of asking questions which just step up from the mundanity of the is and look at categories and frameworks and similarities and differences and patterns, because that is how the organizing mind will remember it, will file it, and then will recover it when it needs it. So finally, to help young people be more likely to be able to transfer it, we need a slightly different lens here. It'll build on what I was just saying about patterns and routines. The person who writes most intelligently for me about this is David Perkins. If you're a scholar of this, then read his wonderful paper, The Rocky Roads to Transfer, where he describes different kinds of knowledge transfer, high road and low road. Low road is much easier. It's when, I don't know, I change my mobile phone and I'm faced with a new mobile phone and the kind of thing prompts me enough so that I know what I'm going to be doing. High road transfer would be something like, I find myself in a supermarket really distressed because something's gone wrong, and somehow into my mind's eye becomes the little mantra that my mum gave me when I cut myself: hold your breath and count to 10. And I kind of just go into a calm down motion, which I find very helpful. That would be an example, a rather ludicrous one, but nevertheless an example of high road transfer. One of the most powerful things we can do is to start to ask questions like, how could I teach this to someone else? As we all know, that is a defining question in expertise, not just in fact, in Dreyfus and Dreyfus's model of expertise. There are about a dozen scholars, as well as Anders Ericsson, who've really thought about models of acquiring expertise. That is their highest intuitive level of expertise, when you can teach it to others. In fact, the highest level is when you don't even know you're doing it. So the four-stage process, I think, for anything we're talking about here that is broadly off-piste or isn't defined in the way that a syllabus lays out knowledge and skill, is a rigorous understanding of what the it is. We've really got to understand it, in this case, creative thinking or questioning or curiosity. We've then got to make some pedagogical choices, and we've really got to manage the classroom and non-classroom environment. Lots of this will be in the co-curriculum, and we've got to build learner engagement through teaching them deliberate practice. I would also urge teaching giving and receiving feedback. I think that's an essential part of what it is to be an effective learner, and so on. It's a cycle, and round we go. I've got 3 minutes left, so I will use them. I think it could be described ecologically, and I was just hinting at that earlier on. And if it were, I think the kind of things you might see in an ecology that was genuinely set on curiosity would include those kinds of things. Now, in my final 3 minutes then, this is not new. And I think one of the other lazy challenges that some of us receive is that it is somehow new. It's not. I can take you back to Greece, to the Enlightenment, to where these ideas developed, but I won't. I'll take you to the end of the 19th century, just on the dawn of the 20th century, where presumably the Kletzing brothers were coming up with the notion, the rather wicked wheeze of 20th century skills. And it was a silly then, except it wasn't, because they specified them. Isn't that interesting? This is so out of our time. When I discovered this, it's a kind of out-of-body moment. Here's adaptability. That's the OECD skill of our day. Here's grit. Eat your heart out, Angela Duckworth. This is North American slang in the 1850s, if you go back and look at the etymology of that. We've got all sorts of things, perseverance, thank you, Carol Dweck. We've got all sorts of things that are words of our day at the moment. We've got a funny kind of intrusion down the bottom here, princely manhood. Not necessarily much in demand in classrooms up and down the land, but who knows? Maybe they are. Maybe they will be. Who knows? So why am I showing? I'm showing you that because forever we've known that there are vital bits of knowledge and skill that we need, and there are characteristics and capabilities as well. The OECD's, I think, thinking about this very thoughtfully at the moment, and this is work in progress that I'm helping them with. That is to disentangle knowledge, to disentangle skills, and you can see they had a kind of drafting failure moment there down at knowledge and attitudes and values. I imagine that the core went up from the designer to the thinker. You seem not to have sent me the text for this bit, and somebody said, no, it's too hard and politically loaded, isn't it? Because that's where the politics is. That's why the 2018 test of global competence is it's a really tricky one. So I think it's pretty clear that I'm after dispositions, and I'm after them absolutely embedded in subjects, that I'm after avoiding the many, many binary false opposites which face us. I'm asking us to stop talking about something that has all to be authentic and real world rather than deliberate practice. We want both. I won't be so motivated in the gym if I'm not with the marathon in my mind's eye. We want knowledge and skills. We want knowledge and skills and character and capability, as the OECD model suggests. I believe we need and want specific and generic skills. I've been modeling that in the Being Creative framework. And I think we need context-specific and generalizable. And we need to understand the difference, and we need to understand how they're made. Which leads me to my penultimate slide. Oh, no, my anti-penultimate, which is we get into a muddle in the middle, don't we? And that's where the work needs to happen, isn't it? It's work in progress. Beware of anybody who says we've got perfect research that shows all of this. We haven't. We've got some strong indication. Just as the Sutton Trust Education Endowment Fund Toolkit doesn't have things to say about some of these things. We have some impact factors on things like collaborative, but we don't have, and indeed metacognition, very high, but we don't have all of this spelled out. So where to next? Where to next? Well, I leave you, as it's an assessment conference, this, in my current dream, which is not crowdsourcing of questions, but citizen science applied to judging the quality of answers. How many of you take part in the RSPB annual garden watch for 1 hour when you look at birds in your garden? You're not an ornithologist, but nevertheless, given the guidance and the likelihood of the different kinds of birds we'll see in our gardens, the reliability of that data, which has been tracked over a number of decades now, is enormously high. It's much higher, dare I say it, than the reliability of a well-paid, well-trained Cambridge assessment marker. It is quite astonishing how reliable it is. Now, I've been asking myself the question, could we get a bit of that into PISA? I don't know the answer, by the way, and please don't quote me, but I don't know the answer. But it would be fun to think that through, and to think that through with people like you who know a heck of a lot more about it than I do. Thank you very much for listening.